Continuing further on the essential topic for information assurance, we have looked before that information assurance is basically a proactive and also a reactive solution. Apart from that, we have also looked at the approach being used in information security management, which is either a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. Today, we are going to continue further in our fundamentals knowledge of information assurance. So, before we go further, always remember to take 5-minute breaks after you watch the video for about 15 to 20 minutes. And in between those breaks, try to review whatever I have presented here, and if you have any question, feel free to ask throughout the lecture hour. So, we continue on part 4 for our lecture, which is on the security system development lifecycle. As you all remember, previously we have looked on the approach of the top-down and also the bottom-up approach in finding the solution in implementing the security control needed to protect the asset. So now we are going to actually look at some of the approach in the security system development lifecycle, one of the approach suggested to be used in information security management. So perhaps some of you is familiar with the terms SDLC. So how is this actually similar or perhaps close to the use of SDLC that you have learned in software engineering? So if you remember in your previous assignment that I have given to you, you are required to actually identify some of the asset and also the related risk or threat related to that asset. You have also been asked to identify some of the proactive and reactive measures with regard to protecting the asset. So now we are going to look closely what are the proper things do you actually need to do in order for you to actually identify the proper control measures when you have actually identified the related threat and risk with regard to the threat. So in SecSDLC, although the name is closely similar to SDLC, but the activities inside it is entirely different. It is starting from the asset identification. From the asset, you identify what are the threats or risks related to the asset, and then identify the proper security measures in order to protect the asset from the risk and threat that you have identified. The activities is the same just like your assignment, but it is defined in a proper way in the SecSDLC. Basically, you have already done this activity, just that we need to actually relate this activity that you have done in your assignment with the steps in the SecSDLC. So in the following chapter or following slides, we are going to look at what those activities are. Now, looking back at your group assignment, you are required to actually identify one of the important assets that you need to protect from the recognized threat and risk. And from the identification, remember that your group also need to identify what are the proactive and reactive components in order to implement the security control to protect that asset that you must actually protect from those threats and risks. So moving further from those activities, there's actually 6 phases that you need to follow in the SecSDLC in terms of recognizing what is the current condition of the asset, followed through by what could be the implementation and how you actually monitor the implementation of those security control. So we begin the phase by the identification or the investigation stage where you need to actually identify, okay, what are the current process and outcome and goals or perhaps the budget that you have to protect the asset that you have identified. Do you have the proper budget to actually begin new security control? And if so, who is going to actually implement that security control, perhaps in terms of software, hardware, or just policy implementation? So one thing you need to remember, security control doesn't necessarily just mean having a proper hardware or software implementation. Sometimes it just means you need to revise an existing policy with regard to protecting the asset. For example, perhaps people are unclear that you have certain control measure or certain rules with regard to the asset that you want to protect. Maybe users are not very clear on how to actually save their password, for example, or they don't know how to make a proper password with regard to securing your account. So this can begin from that very simple policy implementation. And is that policy being understood by your target audience or target group? So it can begin from the investigation. Currently, how is people reacting to the current security policy or current security measure? Is it being understood or is it properly implemented? Who is monitoring the implementation? So this is beginning of the investigation of your protection of asset. And then also we look further after investigation on the analysis. If let's say you want to implement new policy, new software or new hardware, what are the implications? Are your people actually ready to have this new technology or new policy there in your organization? Who is going to make sure that people understood, or are they aware that they need to actually do this? That is the analysis. And then followed by the logical design. So this is where you have the proper blueprint of the implementation. So after you analyze what are the problems and what are the benefits after you implement, now you actually begin designing the implementation. So this can also begin if let's say you implement new security measures, new security policy. Who is going to monitor the assessment of the successful policy implementation? Who is going to do the training? What are the content of the new policy, for example? Okay, so you must remember, security control doesn't just necessarily means you have a new hardware or software. Sometimes you need to handle the people first through implementation of policy. And next one is the physical design. Or let's say if you want to implement the policy is actually physically, how is the policy going to be implemented? Okay, so these include the detailed program and system specification if you actually implement new software or hardware, or you have to include related personnel and also the resources needed to monitor the implementation of that control. Next, you actually have the implementation. Now, after you properly design, now you implement the solution. So during implementation, you need to also have feedback from your target user. So it's the same if you have implemented a new policy, a new software, or a new hardware, you always need to get feedback. Why is it needed? Because you want to see whether from this new security control, what is the success or how do actually people receive those new control? Is people actually easily following the policy that you want to implement, or is your new software or hardware easy to use? These are some of the things you need to ask to your target audience, because certain people will have different implementation or different reception of your new security control. You cannot just expect people to actually accept new things that you introduce. Sometimes you will have resistance. And if you have resistance, you want to know why are they resistant. Is it because they are not knowledgeable? Is it because they don't understand how to use it? So feedback is very important. So this is why sometimes before implementation, you have a proper testing of implementation or a beta test, for example. So you see a certain target group, whether that small group can actually receive or use easily your security control. And then only you properly implement it. And then lastly is the maintenance and change phase. So this is actually based on the feedback. You see whether in the long run, can that security control that you want to implement is actually feasible for a long run. For example, for 1 year, can actually people use this and slowly begin to accept those security control you want to implement? If not, what is the problem? Okay, so you return back and you take down on the changes and the feedback, and then you go back to the investigation state for the next round of implementation. So the SecSDLC, of course, is a continuation process year by year. Perhaps you can have the first implementation V1 and then second implementation V2 implementation. It is an always or continuing improvement of the security control implementation. So you cannot just accept one implementation and just accept it for perhaps 10 years. That is a wrong way to do it, because every security control need to be constantly improved because technology is evolving, people changes. Okay, we have so many things happening. Perhaps one day we can sit together, but another day we cannot sit closely together. So we must always anticipate changes and how to adapt to those changes in our planning and also analysis during the implementation of any protection of our asset. So you must have a proper team to do this, and you must have a proper people that you trust to actually follow through this step in the long run. And of course, the most important thing is documentation. Without documentation, if let's say other people will actually do this next year, they don't know where to look, okay, because they don't know where to find the proper reference. So now we look closely at each of those phases. So begin from the investigation in the SecSDLC. Usually, every investigation begins from a directive from the management. Of course, sometimes management does ask, okay, currently, what do we have to protect? So calling the team, the management needs some input from the team of information security specialists that you have already assigned or recognized. So it begins from the directive from the management, find out about some of the things that's happening in your organization, which asset do you actually need to protect, okay, and then what policy do we currently have in order to protect that asset. So the team will begin reading through all the existing policy and how successful is those policy in protecting the asset. Apart from that, they also will look at the current security control in terms of hardware or software implementation. Is there proper security log? Is there proper people actually responsible to use and implement the security control? And then your team will be assembled to analyze the problem, if there's any, define the scope or the goals of the security control that you want to actually implement, and of course, a feasibility analysis. Feasibility analysis means that you actually weigh the pros and cons if you, let's say, stay with the current security measure that you have. So you bring back this information to the management. So you, let's say you have a proper cost benefit analysis and you present to the management. You tell them, okay, if we don't actually improve our security measure or our security control, this could happen and causes certain loss to the organization with regard to this asset. So the most important thing to the management is, of course, in terms of monetary gain or losses. So if you want to actually make sure that whatever you are suggesting to the organization to be implemented, the cost benefit analysis must be done thoroughly and correctly to actually project what are the losses that you could incur if the incident happened, or perhaps is there no changes in terms of financial if, let's say, you prefer to stay or use the current implementation. And also it depends on the financial status of your company, whether you have the financial capability to actually implement it. Because if you don't have the financial capability, what are the other things or the alternative to having or not having the security measure? Can you actually bear with the possible losses, or is there any existing security control that you can use to protect that asset from that possible losses? So this must be done during the investigation stage in the SecSDLC. So after identifying what needs to be done or what not need to be done, the next phase is the analysis stage. So in this stage, we need to actually have a proper analysis of the current policy or current security measure that we have. Which of those measures can actually be improved and which measure can actually perhaps being thrown back or perhaps not used anymore, because perhaps we have losses that could incur if we continue to use those existing measures, or we have something to gain if we improve the measure that we have to a next level. So this includes of relevant legal issues that could affect the design of the security solution. Legal issues sometimes include just perhaps simply just using a license of certain security software, or perhaps in terms of whether the client or user will be able to actually sue us if we don't properly protect the asset. So we look back at this in terms of analysis, whether it's good to stay on the current course, or what are the causes if we actually implement new security policy or software and hardware to protect our asset. So the risk management begins in this stage, because once we identify the risk, we cross-check that risk with the current policy and security measure in terms of hardware and software that we have. So from that, we actually try to justify if we are actually going to implement new measure, what will it cost? If we don't have a new control measure, what will it cost to the organization? Okay, so from that, we actually do the analysis, and from that analysis, we will decide whether to go on with the security measure that we have, or to have new security measure comes in to replace the previous one. After agreeing on what security measure to implement, now comes the design stage. So design can also include designing the software, designing the hardware layout, and also designing the policy that is going to be used with regard to the security policy or security measures that you want to implement. Of course, hardware and software is a very straightforward design, but policy design includes how are you going to actually monitor the implementation of the policy, how are people going to react to the policy, is the policy easily understood? So you need to properly design the wording of the policy, the implementation, and also the monitoring of the policy, if we are talking about the policy. Of course, software and hardware design is very much straightforward, and you already know this, that in order to design software and hardware, you need to properly perhaps know where the data come from. For example, how to actually protect the data, who is actually going to use the hardware, for example, how are you going to monitor the usage of the hardware and software, for example. So this is done in a logical design phase. How is the process flow of each of the security control? Who is going to monitor, and how are the data is being saved and protected in terms of the security control that you are implementing. Now, in the physical design phase, is actually identifying the proper people to use the security control and to actually do the monitoring if you want to actually implement the security control. This includes if you want to implement new policy, also new hardware and software, because basically means that once you get it out there, okay, how are you going to make sure that those security control can be followed through and can actually make sure that the asset that you want to protect is protected by the new security control, regardless whether the security control is a software, hardware, or in terms of policy implementation. Also, you need to look at how or what are the alternatives should the solution that you suggested fail, and can you actually agree on the final design implementation? If you have this policy, who will actually cross-check whether the policy is being understood? If you have the software, who will be the people using it, and will that people be able to understand how to use it? If you have the software or the hardware, do you have the actually technology capability for the people actually to understand how to use that new hardware and software once you want to implement that solution? So these are the things that you must consider in the design phase. You already decide that you want to do it. Now you decide on how is the flow of the control implementation that you want to put in there, and how are you going to monitor the implementation later on? Now, further looking into the design phase in the SecSDLC, it can be categorized into three types of controls. You have managerial controls, followed by the operational, and also lastly, the technical control. Of course, management control or managerial starting from the strategic planner and executed by security administration of the organization. This simply means that what are the current policy that people actually must understand and follow with regard to protecting the asset. This is what I mean by the management or managerial control. Followed through by the operational control, this include in terms of operation in the long run, do you have proper security recovery if some incident should happen? Do you have the proper people ready to take action should something happen with regard to the asset that you want to protect? And then also, lastly, you look at the technical control to protect your asset. So in designing the security control to protect your asset, you can look at these three categories. Either in terms of managerial control, which is you look at the policy, and then or you look at the operational control, whether you have the proper procedure that you can implement if some threat actually happen, or you have the technical control that you want to implement. So these three control can be designed and planned in the design stage. So either you can design a new policy, a new strategy, or a new security control altogether. So in terms of managerial, you can look at policy revision. Also look at operational, whether people can understand the procedure that you need to follow should certain things happen. Do you know who to report to? So that can also be revised in the design stage of the SecSDLC. And then lastly, the category of technical control, where you have actually the control in terms of hardware and software implementation to enforce the security measure that you want to implement. So these three controls can be looked separately, or they can be looked together as one unit that is actually working together to protect the asset. So after designing, the next logical step is of course to implement the solution that we have designed. So what happens during the implementation is that we want to make sure that whatever design that we have actually agreed upon can be successfully implemented. This includes whatever software we develop or acquired, or whatever hardware that we have bought, and whatever policy that we have planned to implement can be successfully implemented without any problem. But of course, problem will arise. So this is why the implementation also include the testing and also the reviewing of whatever we have implemented. So we want to see whether our solution is suitable for our target group or target user. This also includes the personal issue, whether we have the proper manpower to actually use the solution that we want, and whether the people that we intend for the security mechanism can actually benefit from the security measure that we have planned for. And also, the most important thing also is to make sure that we properly plan the implementation and make sure that implementation has the right people to actually support the implementation process and the documentation process. Because in the long run, the SecSDLC is of course a continuous cycle and also an evolving process. Because it cannot just be content for one implementation, the implementation needs to always be improvised and improved for the benefit of our organization. If there is any shortcomings in the implementation, we need to document it and then find the problem. Why is it problematic in the implementation? And perhaps some process can be improved. And of course, the next step following the implementation is the maintenance and improvement stage. So in the maintenance stage, of course, whatever we have implemented need to always be reviewed and improvised. So it must be ensured that whatever we are implementing, what are the desired result, and wherever we are targeting or the objective of the implementation can be successfully recorded and also be properly monitored. If there's any problem, then what is the cause of the problem? Is it the personal problem, or is it the hardware or software problem? So this is what we are actually reviewing back in the maintenance stage, whether the security control that we are implementing is actually beneficial, or perhaps it is actually counterintuitive. Is it actually making difficulties for our target user? So we review back our implementation, whether our desired effect is actually there, or whether it is actually counterintuitive and causing a lot more problem than the solution we implemented. So we gather back our team, we look back at the documentation, see where the problem is, and go back to the SecSDLC phases one by one and see at which stage that we can improve our security control implementation. Alright, so we take a 5-minute break from this, and while having the break, please review back all the SecSDLC phases, and if you have any point that you want to ask me, please do so. Okay, so we take a 5-minute break, then we will continue on the next part. In part 5, we are going to look at the security professionals usually involved in a security control or security management team. Of course, the very important building block of any project is the team. So in this part, we are going to look at some of the individuals or expertise that you will need in order to successfully implement or plan for a security control that you want to have to protect your asset. So in any organization, we usually have two types of professionals in the team. So first of all, we have the management team, which usually caters for the policy and procedures that can be implemented in order to protect the asset or in order to make sure business runs smoothly. And also we have the security professionals, which have a wide range of expertise in terms of technical, in terms of perhaps policy knowledge, or in terms of personnel management. So we need to work together in order to make sure that whatever is planned or whatever is being held as the objective of the organization can successfully be implemented and also properly planned from the very beginning to the very execution of the project. Now, usually in any information security project team, you will encounter or you will need this type of individuals or professionals. So for example, let's say between TNB and Uniten, usually we have a working together ecosystem where projects from TNB, okay, is being given from some of the personnel at TNB as the project champion. And then in Unit 10, for example, we have our team of researcher and also developer. Okay, this is from my experience where we work together in a project which involve a threat modeling platform, and we have our team of researcher, which also I'm involved in. Okay, so we gather together in terms of having the knowledge to actually plan for the solution in terms of perhaps the threat modeling algorithm and also the expertise in terms of programming the solution. And then this requirement came from TNB through the project champion. So the project champion from TNB is actually supervising the project and giving the requirement from TNB to the team in Unit 10. So in Unit 10, we have our team leader, and the team leader actually distribute the job among our researcher and the programmer that came in the form of perhaps our research assistant and perhaps the programmer that we hire to help us during the development. So the researcher in terms of the lecturer and also our researcher came into this platform and give our expertise in terms of our knowledge in terms of the management algorithm, the threat modeling platform, and also all those knowledge that we have from our past project, and then we work together and give the solution back to the project champion at TNB. So this is basically a very normal ecosystem in any information security project. The champion is usually the head or the project manager, and then we have the team leader that have their own sets of experts within the team. So the role of the champion is to actually get the requirement from the management, what do they want, and then from there he or she will give the assignment to the project leader, and then the project leader usually is the one that knows for that particular project who are the experts to bring in and to provide the solution to be given to the top management requirement. So this is where we have the policy developer, the risk assessment specialist, and then we have the security professional, for example, and also the technical team which provide the programming or the hardware solution. So in any of these security project team, someday you will be part of this team, and then you will also need to actually have these skills, whether in terms of managing the project themselves or in terms of identifying which individual is suitable for a task. Okay, just like you see in Mission Impossible, you have a set of people with a different skill. So you need to identify which people to bring in with you to the project in order to successfully deliver a solution based on the requirement from the management to protect the asset. Okay, so one way or another, either you are perhaps some of the technical expert there, or you will be the one in the team leader that is deciding who can you bring to your project. And of course, a very important component is also the targeted end user in the project team. Why you need the end user? Of course, you are actually making the solution to protect the asset, and these assets are usually being used, or actually we make it for the end users. So without the end users, we will not know what are the possible requirements to suit the targeted end user. Because like I said earlier, each set of target end user have different requirements, because not all of our users have technical know-how. Okay, we cannot just simply say because I know how to use a computer, then we expect all people out there know how to use it. Just because I know how biometric works doesn't mean that solution is suitable for all people in the public there. Because sometimes we have a problem. What if the biometric cannot be read because the nature of work of our target user? Perhaps they are always sweaty and their hand is always dirty. So is biometric fingerprint suitable for them? Okay, and perhaps the peripheral themselves is very fragile. So how can we have a 100% detection if we are using biometric? What are the possible solutions for this target user? So this is where end user is also an important part of the information security project team. We need to include them during the analysis and also the requirement analysis, what we need to actually implement for this type of group. Because the key here is that not all solutions can be used by all people at one time. So we cannot just simply assume one solution is suitable for all box of group. Okay, so you need to anticipate for each specific group. Okay, can this solution be made for them? Okay, is it suitable for this group also? So this is where we need to find the requirement, perhaps do some interview, and then do some beta testing whether our implementation can be used by this target group. If can't, what is the problem? And then what are the alternatives? So this is why end user is also part of the team, because they need to actually bring input, what are the required, consider the solution that you want to use, and is the solution that we are actually suggesting suitable for them after that. So in terms of hiring proper people for your project team, you need to actually remember what or what expertise do you want in your team in terms of contributing in the information security sector. So first of all, you must identify what expertise do you want in your team in terms of your expertise, the technical expertise, and perhaps also in the policy knowledge and also the auditing knowledge, for example. So from there, you do the advertisement in hiring. So you want this set of people to actually come in into your project with this set of skills to come in as the information security expert. So how they will contribute, you also describe in the job description. And then secondly, you must plan the proper function. Once they enter the organization, what will be their function in that project? Because if they don't know what their role is in that organization, let's say in terms of policy expert, in terms of auditing experts, in terms of the technical expertise in programming the security function, then upon hiring, they will not know actually what to do. And then thirdly, make sure they understand, or all the people in the organization understand their role in terms of contributing to the security control and the security project within the organization. So each of them have a specific role in order to protect the asset that your organization wants to protect. And then lastly, make sure that all the people in the organization practice good security practices and ensure that everything that they do have certain impact in terms of security. And if they perhaps didn't keep very well in terms of didn't follow very well in terms of the security policy and procedures that you have in your organization, the very asset that you want to protect can be jeopardized by the very action, because sometimes they don't know, okay, if that information is perhaps very private and cannot be shared elsewhere, and then they will make the mistake of actually oversharing and leak the information later on to the public, perhaps not intentionally, but of course it will be jeopardizing to your project. So make sure you hire the right people and make sure these people understand their responsibility with regard to protecting the asset of the organization. If they know their responsibility, of course, they will also ensure that whatever they do will be done responsibly, and your asset and even your project will be protected and secure in the long run. So in terms of security professional roles, we have this set of people in the organization. Usually we have the management, we have the administration, and we also have the technical people and also the users. So in the following section, we will look at these diverse roles one by one. So in any organization, we have the senior management position. So usually we will begin from the CEO, which is very top management, or usually the owner of the organization. And then under him, we have the CIO position. So usually the CIO will get the requirement or provide the solution to the CEO with regard to any technology or information system solution that we want to actually implement. So how they get this information is usually from the CISO. So the CISO is actually the ones that actually understand for every solution that they want to protect or they want to provide, who will be the technical team inside the organization, or perhaps which consultant or which vendor that they can approach to provide the solution. So the CISO is actually responsible for assessing the solution that they are actually planning, for the managing of the team, and also implementation of any solution that they want to actually do. So after planning for the solution, he will report back to the CIO, and the CIO will report whatever findings and the solution to the CEO. So this is how an organization works in a very big corporate setting. So the CIO is presenting the solution, the CISO is actually planning for the solution and assemble its team. So after the CISO, this is where we come into the actual organization where we have the communities of expert or interest. This is where we have the information security professionals and information technology professionals, and we have the organization management professional. Of course, information security will have the expertise on perhaps security policy and also the proper security solution in terms of hardware and software. And also we have the IT specialist in terms of the IT infrastructure to support the security policy. And then we have the group of people that is solely on managing the human resources. So this is where perhaps when we need to identify what types of group of people we have in an organization and what solution is suitable for each group of people we have in our organization. So these three groups must work together and then find a solution and report back to the CISO. So every organization that actually caters for information security solution must have this group of people. So this is where when hiring, it's important for you to identify what type of expertise do you want and do you have that particular set of skills within your organization or not to provide the solution. If not, you have to do hiring or perhaps you bring in consultant from the outside or hire someone on a temporary basis. Again, depends on your requirement to protect the asset or perhaps provide that solution to your customer. Also, another important aspect of actually finding a solution to protecting the important asset in your organization is to understand the role of data ownership within the organization or the one asset that you are protecting. So there are three groups of data ownership. So first of all, we have the data owner. So the data owner is basically responsible for the security and use of a particular set of information. So for example, you have information about your purchase record. So who is the data owner of this? So perhaps the data owner for the purchase record is the finance department within your organization. And perhaps you have a record of personnel or people that work in your company. So the data owner for that is your HR department, for example. And then in terms of data custodian, this is the one that is responsible for storage, maintenance, and protection of information. So let's say after the information from the finance department and the HR department, where does the information go to when it is being stored or backup? Who is responsible to do the backup and who is responsible to do the storage of that information? And then lastly is data users. For the HR information and the finance information, who will actually use that information? Because not necessarily if the data owner is the finance department, only the finance department will use that information. Sometimes information from the finance department is being used by perhaps the purchasing department because they want to see the finance record from the finance department, and then that information will be used by the financial people in order to track the financial capability of the organization. So the data users can be a multitude of very different category of users. So it's important if you want to protect your asset to identify the data owner, the data custodian, and also the data users. Because if you don't understand who actually stores the data, who actually the owner of the data, then you cannot successfully design a proper policy, a proper security solution, and a proper hardware mechanism to protect the asset that you deem as important. So in part 5, we have identified the people and roles in the organization needed for information security project. So we take a 5-minute break before we continue to part 6, and then please review all the points that we have learned previously before we continue to part 6, the need for security. Now before we begin, think about the recent incidents as an example of what incident could actually cause serious harm to an organization's operation. Okay, So for one example, let's say currently we have the incident of the JNT operation. You know, the JNT is a postal service, and then we have the worker is on strike and perhaps damaging the customers whatever customers postage and also whatever item that they are sending through the JNT services. So how can this incident actually affect the operation of JNT? Of course, on one part, people will be reluctant to use their service, and another part, it will also jeopardize their brand name. So these are some of the example of how your important asset, which is the reputation, can be affected by an incident and after it's being shared on social media. Because nowadays, news travel really fast on social media. Whatever happens just 1 second ago can immediately be shared on social media and also even faster than the news page. You get news faster in social media nowadays compared to what you have in the official channel, even if it's not confirmed as true or not. But sometimes, even if it's not verified, the news travel a lot more faster and people sometimes tend to believe it because more people are sharing it. And then from the repercussion of that incident, now people are perhaps reluctant to use JNT services. And now they are opting for other options, and this will cause the effect in terms of business operation where perhaps the income to the JNT company will be a lot lesser from that incident. And perhaps in terms of operation, people will not choose to actually work for JNT and work for their competitors. For example, the Post Laju, or you have Grab, or you have also DHL and also GDAX, for example. So certain incident will have a direct impact of how an organization actually operates, whether they can operate successfully or in the opposite. So from that incident, we need to actually think about in our organization, what are we actually securing? Sometimes what we are securing is not directly related to our hardware and software that we use. Sometimes, just like the previous example, we are actually trying to protect our name, our brand, and perhaps our business. Okay, it's not directly people can actually hack our business directly, but sometimes whatever happens in the operation, okay, people can actually affect our business if some news is actually affecting how people actually perceive us in the long run, because our brand name is also part of our asset and these assets needs to be protected. So how do we actually ensure that that asset is protected in terms of operation? So this is where a policy comes in. Sometimes it comes in terms of managing our people. So how to ensure that our people are managed very well? Okay, so in terms of information security management, you don't actually just care about the technicalities. You also need to care about your people, and does your policy actually protect your people as well? Because when you protect your people, you can actually protect your brand name, which is also part of your asset. Okay, so these are the first thing you need to ask yourself and your organization. What are you securing? What is your asset? Okay, so in your exercise, you also identify what types of asset you deem as important to your organization. Part of it should be your brand name if you are actually doing business with the public. So how do you actually protect your brand name? Of course, in providing very good service. And also, nowadays, you need to actually be a very good organization that also treats your worker very well. If you not, okay, someone will actually uh, throw out their frustration in social media or leak that information outside, and then your business operation can also be affected without having people to actually hack your business or perhaps uh, do something to your server and your operation. They can just jeopardize your business through whatever news being shared in social media. Of course, this is directly related to the challenges in latest technologies. Nowadays, news travel fast, whether you like it or not, whether to your advantage or disadvantage. So whatever bad things happen to your company or how you treated your customer, how you treated your worker, this news travel very fast. And our people are very vindictive and very decisive in what they deem as right or wrong. Okay, even sometimes the news is not entirely confirmed as true. Okay, if a lot of people share it at one time, it can be perceived as truth by some people. Although we always instigate to people to actually confirm any news before spreading it, but sometimes this is not happening because it travels a lot faster than the one that is counter acting to the news. Okay, just the same as the case for JNT, because the wrongful act from the management to the worker has been shared. So, and also the action of the worker that wrongfully treated the customer's items. Okay, so in a sense, this also impact how people actually perceive your business. So when you wrongfully manage your people also wrongfully treated other people's items. And of course, your customer doesn't feel safe using your service. So in the long run, apart from just protecting yourself from hacker, you also need to actually consider, okay, governing your people and treating your customer very well. So how to ensure it? So this is where you need to remember, information assurance is a proactive and a reactive process. So before doing any regrettable action, you need to understand the repercussion from the action. So this is true when you are managing people, because your people is also your asset, and this asset is very important because it is actually being perceived by people to how you actually treated other people and also how you provide services. Like it or not, these are the challenges with the latest technology, because news travel fast, people want things very fast, and whatever action comes to that is also very fast and swift. Also, from within the organization, you need to decide whether you have certain policy to protect your private data within your organization from your own people. Because nowadays, we have the bring your own device policy where workers can also bring their smartphone and also their laptops and also even their personal computers to the organization. Okay, on one side, it saves the expenses of the company without having to provide for extra devices for the worker to work on. But the downside is that those devices are bring back home. Okay, and when they are home, sometimes the security mechanism is not very tight. So whatever is being used on the users or your worker's phone or your worker's laptop, for example, is not properly protected once they are going outside of your organization. Perhaps when they are in your organization, you have a proper firewall within the network that the users are actually using. But once they go home, they are using their own private network, their own perhaps data, then this is where perhaps the threat can come in. So you need to consider with regard to what information you have within your organization, and then how many devices are actually coming and going into and outside from your organization. Will you permit the bringing your own device policy, or there are certain restrictions to which area or what type of work, okay, that people can actually bring their own devices? Because to some extent, some organization that handles very private information doesn't permit even bringing in your smartphone into the vicinity of the office. So they have to take their phone outside and then only take back the phones when they are going home. So it depends on the types of secrecy or the privacy that you want within your company, or the type of document you have within your organization that you want to actually protect. Okay, when or where you have to draw the line depends on what you want to protect. As future security professionals, you must also be very well versed and also perhaps be well updated in the current threats currently coming to any security infrastructure. Okay, so perhaps you need to subscribe to our web's databases or their website and keep up to date with the activities, or even following newsletters regarding security so that you are very well versed with the current threat or news with regard to security happenings around the world. Because you are the future professionals in this field, so it is important for you to keep updated, okay, and not waiting for actually perhaps doing the interview for you to get updated. It is nice for you to actually read or follow certain pages or newsletters to get yourself updated so that you will be well versed in what is happening around you with regard to the information security field. Because these threats are always evolving, technology is also evolving, and also just as your Windows need to properly and frequently be updated, your knowledge in information security will also need to updated from time to time. So we return back to the question, what needs to be protected? So of course, the most straightforward answer is your IT and network infrastructure. Because without that, we cannot actually communicate even within our people, let alone to the people outside. Our customer cannot communicate with us and we cannot actually promote our business elsewhere and communicate with our client outside. Secondly is of course our IP or intellectual property. IP doesn't necessarily important if you are an IT company. Sometimes if you are a food company or for example or food business, you have your IP which is your food. Okay, so this secret recipe is very important to your company and you can't afford to have that secret recipe being stolen or being shared to the public. Because once it's being shared, you don't have the advantage of having that delicious recipe that you can sell for a very handsome amount of price. And then third of course is financials and financial data. Because from this information, usually people can see who is your business partner, who is your greatest client, how much money do you have. So financial and financial data is very important that you need to also protect. Thirdly is the service that you provide. So if your service is being disrupted perhaps from DDoS attack, okay, so people cannot actually do business with you because they cannot actually get to your business. So one day, for example, you have an e-commerce site, for example, you are selling items on this site, but people for one day cannot actually gain access to your service. Or perhaps you are a banking company, okay, then one day your customer cannot actually do monetary transaction on your website. So this downtime causes certain losses to your customer and even to you. So your service is also an asset that needs to be protected. And then of course, lastly is your reputation. If something happened to your company, if you actually do some wrongdoing, of course, your reputation will be affected. Just like the case of the JNT incident, the reputation is actually affected and people actually very didn't prefer to do business with the JNT company for a short while now. So that is one example of the reputation and how it actually being valued as a company asset. So these are the things that you need to consider when actually thinking about what needs to be protected within the organization. So in terms of what needs to be protected, you need to understand every asset have their own vulnerability. So your task here as security professionals in the future is to understand that each of these vulnerability with regard to the asset must be handled and protected because every single asset that you have, they have possible vulnerabilities that must be patched or they must be protected using your security control measure. So you must consider, you must have a proper awareness of there is a possibility for your asset to be vulnerable and how to actually patch those vulnerability or protect it using your security control measure. Okay, so the weakness needs to be overcome or needs to be patched up, and the most important action that you need to begin is understand, yes, there is a weakness. You must not be very proud to say that there is no weakness in your asset or in your system, because there will be. Because in terms of information assurance, you must remember it is proactive and a reactive process. Proactive, anticipate the weakness before it actually there, and anticipate the type of threat that can actually affect our asset because of the vulnerabilities that we have recognized. And the reactive is identifying what to do if that vulnerability is being exploited. Again, the key here is to understand and accept there is vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities must be protected and overcome by you with your solution with your team. So once you understand that there are vulnerabilities, then you must understand that those vulnerabilities can be exploited by possible threats. So this threat can come in the form of malicious software, or malicious individuals, or hardware or software failure, or internal attacker, which is your own people or people working in an organization, or can be come in the form of equipment theft. So understanding the vulnerabilities that you have within your asset, and also anticipating what type of threat that can actually exploit those vulnerability, will help you to come out with a possible solution for your security control to protect those assets that you deem as important. So understand your asset, understood there is a vulnerability, anticipate the threat that could exploit the vulnerability. So before we end this session, let's look back of what we have covered so far in this chapter. So first of all, we have looked at the SecSDLC and the steps that is required for any security team to follow in order to provide a security solution to protecting the asset in the organization. And then we identified the group of individuals or security professionals needed in any security project, and then followed by identification of perhaps what needs to be protected, and also the asset, threat, and also the vulnerability that you need to identify in order to provide a very sound solution in terms of the proactive solution and the reactive solution. So I hope this session has been beneficial to you. Okay, so if you have any problem or some portion of our explanation that you find it hard to follow, feel free to ask me during the discussion. Okay, so I hope I see you again, and I hope that this session has been beneficial to you. So thank you for joining. I see you again later.